Happy Easter. Have you ever found yourself so engrossed in an activity that all of a sudden, without any apparent provocation, a thought just comes forcing its way into your mind, reminding you of some deeply held secret? Have you found that stepping out of the shadows of your mind, all of a sudden there is this presence of regrettable decision or a poor lapse in judgment? Something that just seems to, every once in a while, just rear its head and just bring you this sense of angst. I think we've all had circumstances like that. And I often think that it's in those moments that your whole countenance changes. If you're around a crowd of people, it doesn't take them very long before they look at you and say, are you okay? Is everything all right? Because that memory has just triggered something in you. The older I get, the keener I am aware of the fact of how a troubled or unresolved past has a way of just rearing its head and affecting everything about our present and our future. If we're not careful, it just suffocates the life out of us in such a way that guilt prevents us from moving on. Regret, it could just block this path of personal healing. Or shame, because such an overwhelming burden that you find yourself paralyzed to it. And it's kind of hard to engage the present when you're feeling this way, isn't it? That's why today I want us to know that rather than just pray that the lock that we've placed on the door of unwanted memories holds tight, there could be another path, there could be another alternative. That's the story that I want to share with you today. Because we all know someone who can profit, right, from this kind of good news of having their chains of regret or shame or guilt removed. It could be a son or a daughter. It could be a college roommate, a spouse, maybe even you. But we're held so tightly by this unwelcome past that it's kind of hard to move forward. I believe that there is a path that can embrace a brighter future. I think there's a better version of today that we can experience. There's a power that Jesus gives us that says, I want you to step into these new promises. So I'm going to invite you to take a little walk with me this morning. I want you to immerse yourself in a story that I'm going to share with you, found in the Gospel of John. And while the story illustrates one man's journey, I think that we could all extrapolate from his experience and begin to apply that into our lives personally, because those principles are the same. So there is this story where Jesus now has already risen from the dead. His resurrection is undeniable. All the disciples, they had talked with him, they have seen him. He has appeared to over 500, it says in the scriptures, during this period of time. And now he is meeting up with his disciples once again. Only this time, the disciples, they're not really sure what their next move is going to be. They had been so overwhelmed with him being arrested and crucified that it was off balance. And then when they're confronted with the reality of his resurrection, they really don't know what to do. So what we find in the story is that they've gathered together and they thought maybe just being together might bring a sense of comfort, and they just did what was familiar. They just went fishing. Peter was the instigator. He calls them all and says, look, why don't we just go fishing? And they agreed, and the next thing you know, we have this scene that unfolds for us in John chapter 21. It says, so they went out and got into a boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not recognize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, friends, haven't you any fish? And they replied, no. He says, throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some. And when they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. It's obvious as you start reading the story that Jesus is orchestrating this whole scene. He's behind this encounter with the disciples, and you may begin to wonder why, but I don't think it's too hard for us to envision, especially when you recognize that this scene really mimics the very beginnings of their journey with Jesus, the very first memories of an encounter with Jesus. It was at that time that they had just come in from fishing all night, and again, they were without fish, and Jesus tells them to cast their boat out again and lower down their nets. And when they did, they collected so much fish, it almost turned the boat over. And then they look to Jesus, and he says, come, follow me, and I'll make you fishers of men. And so the story begins. And how it began is now how it's ending. Jesus, once again, supernaturally fills their nets with fish because he's calling them to be fishers of men. Story goes on, says the disciples whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it's the Lord. And as soon as Simon Peter heard him say, it's the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around himself and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from the shore, about 100 yards. And when they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals with fish on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish you have just caught. Peter climbed aboard and dragged the net to shore. It was a net full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, come, have breakfast. None of the disciples dared ask him, who are you? For they already knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread, gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. And this was the third time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. You know, when you read a story like this, sometimes you should pay careful attention to all the details that are in the story. Because those details, they kind of give this sense of realism to the story. The number of fish, how heavy the net was, how far they were from the shore, all of these kind of facts and figures that just underscore that this is an event that truly did happen. But Jesus had more on his mind than just a simple breakfast reunion. What we find in our text here is that Jesus is going to, now that the breakfast is over, he's going to take Peter on a little walk because he has something that he wants to talk to Peter about. There is something that needs to be resolved for Peter. But before we go into the rest of the story, I think for us to be able to fully, embrace all that is happening, it would do us well if we just went back and began to think about some of the encounters that Jesus had with Peter on all of the events leading up to his crucifixion. Because as we see this dialogue, I think it will just enhance our understanding of the story that is before us. So allow me just a moment to just reintroduce some of these events. One of them is at the Last Supper. Jesus there breaks bread and says, this is my body now, which is broken for you. Take and eat. He takes the cup and he says, this introduces a new covenant that I make with you. And then, as that meal is coming to a close, Jesus looks at the 12 and he says to them, this very night, you will fall away on account of me. Peter replies, even if all fall away on account of you, I never will. I tell you the truth. This very night, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. But Peter declares, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. How do you think it would feel to be called out amongst your brothers? There's no tone of animus here in Jesus. It's a statement that he's making rather just matter-of-factly, just this is what's going to happen. And Peter is taken back and he kind of defends himself. Well, they're in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? when the soldiers come to arrest Jesus. And as they carry him away, it's written for us in John 18 that Peter and another disciple were following after Jesus. He went with them into the high priest's courtyard, but after, Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the girl that was on duty there, and brought Peter in. And then listen to what it says. The girl at the door asked Peter, "You're not one of his disciples, are you?" And he replies, "I am not." It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire that they had made to keep them warm. And as Peter stood warming himself, he was asked again, "You're not one of his disciples, are you?" And he denied it, saying, "I am not." One of the high priest's servants challenged him, "Didn't I see you with him in the olive grove?" And again, Peter denied it. And at that moment, a rooster began to crow. Matthew gives us a little bit more insight into what followed. He says, Peter remembered the words Jesus had spoken, "Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and he wept bitterly. Think about for the moment, what happened to all that bravado? What happened to, "I will never disown you"? What happened to that big response that everybody else might run away, but Lord, I will never leave you? I'm sure he was probably pretty sincere. And for all of us, we might think that, hey, if it was me, I would act differently. But hey, just chill out for a moment, because unless you're in that situation, you're not sure how you might act. For Peter, no doubt there is some deep-seated regret. So now I want to turn us back to the text for this morning, because after sharing that breakfast on the beach, Jesus takes time to talk with Peter. When Jesus asked him to go for this walk, what do you think was going on in Peter's mind at that moment? What would be going on in your mind? The very one that you claimed all this allegiance, you have just betrayed. And now he comes back and he's saying, "Look, how about you and I, we take a walk? There's something I want to talk to you about." And then what do you think goes on through his mind when Jesus starts asking him a bunch of questions like this? "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he replies, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Then feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me?" And he answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." "Then take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And now the text tells us Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." And Jesus says, "Well, then feed my sheep." Then he looked at him and said, "Follow me." If it's not completely obvious to you at this point, let me just draw some of these lines for you. At that Last Supper, all the disciples had gathered together and they were sharing a meal. Do you think maybe there may have been a little trigger going on inside the mind of Peter when they were sitting on that beach and they were passing bread and fish and engaged in this conversation? Because none of those other disciples were with Peter at that time. They may not be fully aware how all of these events went down. Only Peter really knows that in his heart. And now he's sitting there amongst all of his brothers, and they're sitting there sharing a meal and having this conversation. And maybe inwardly, his mind has been triggered. And those deep secrets, right, that regrettable, event, now it just begins to step out of its shadow and occupy his mind. I think also that maybe you got to remember that Jesus said that you were going to deny me 3 times. And now he's asking him 3 questions. And before that, they were standing by a fire. Have you ever had a moment in your life where maybe it's just a smell? Maybe it's something visually that just in a nanosecond, your mind just goes racing off to this place. Right around the first mow of a season, I played so much football when I was younger and in my college years, right, that soon as that grass is cut, I'm thinking about all those daily doubles, man, that we used to have to go and run. I'm way past daily doubles now. But you let that grass be cut, and man, my mind just goes right there. You think maybe that fire and this conversation and Jesus and these questions began to just trigger in Peter a memory that he would rather lie dormant? Well, the text tells you that Peter was deeply hurt. After Jesus asked the questions, why do you think that is? Do you think maybe the bitterness of that dreadful night just crept back into his heart? Maybe Peter was reliving the moment that he would rather forget. Maybe Peter's guilt was beginning to have this crippling effect on him. And once again, he found himself being held captive by his past. Has that ever happened to you? I remember reading in a journal of psychiatry a story about training elephants and how they would put a chain around an elephant's, for a circus. They would put a chain around the foot of a young elephant, and like a leash on a dog, they would just put a stake into the ground. And that little elephant would try as hard as he could to get away, but he couldn't. And they said there's 2 things about an elephant. One is they're not very bright. They're not like a dog, that kind of does something and then he kind of figures it out. It takes a long time for the elephant to add up all the numbers, but he never forgets. And so that little elephant tries and tugs and pulls until he's exhausted, and then the next day he gets up and he tries again, and he goes to bed exhausted, and the next day the same, until finally he just realizes, I am never going to get away. And at that juncture, what is it that's keeping that elephant staked to the ground? It's no longer that chain, because by this time, once that happens, they take the chain, they take the stake out, and just allow the chain to just drag on the floor, because the mere sound of that chain reminds the elephant, I am never getting away. And so I propose to you, what are those stakes that are embedded deeply in your heart or in your mind that are holding you captive? That every once in a while, in the midst of maybe a lot of fun and good times, and then something triggers this memory, and the next thing you know, you're back in this one spot again. See, that's why when I read this story and I think this encounter had less to do with Peter's past and more to do about his future. You catch that? It's less about his past than it is about the future. Jesus sought Peter out, I believe, to rescue him from the past, to direct him to fulfill God's call on his life, for him to experience a life that is redeemed. Jesus knows, hey, I called you to become a fisher of men. I gave you the name Peter, which means rock, because I saw something in you. Jesus' words was a demonstration of his love and affirmation for Peter. There's nothing in the text that gives you any indication that in any way it was accusatory, judgmental. There wasn't like this time when Jesus looked at Peter and said, yo, what was up with that? I did all this stuff for you, and this is how you repay me? You don't read of any of that. Jesus knows the end from the beginning. In fact, he told him before it even happened that this was going to take place. He would have had more than ample opportunity to write him off, but he didn't. Instead, he chooses a moment with all kinds of triggers to get Peter's attention so that Peter would know that God is more interested in his future than in the past. I want you to feed my lambs. I want you to go out there and take care of the sheep. I want you to follow me, Peter. I don't want you to be stuck in this spot, reliving it over and over again. What good is that going to do you? What good is that going to do the kingdom of God? All these gifts and talents that are poured out into your life are going to be laid to waste. Why? Because you're just rehashing a past that should never be meant to define you. Because see, that's the danger. You start adding years to your life, and before you know it, you're more defined by the things you didn't do than the things that you can do. Allowing your past to keep you from embracing all that God may have for you. Allowing your past to place you on the sidelines. Jesus doesn't want your past to define you. He was forcing Peter to deal with his, and in the process extended his forgiveness and began to strengthen Peter's resolve. Because all you have to do is turn the pages of the scriptures and you see that Peter became a rock. You see, over the past 6 weeks, we've been in a sermon series called Rise Up. It was a series designed to lift the fog that robs us of joy sometimes. A fog that could be maybe defined as anger or anxiety, where we allow our doubt or despair or our bent towards perfectionism to keep us from fully experiencing this new life that Jesus promises. Instead, we were called upon to take a look at the forest and not get lost in the trees of our troubles, to exercise power through the resurrection of Jesus. So in this series, after every service, we challenged everyone to come and identify what those fears or doubts or addictions might be in their life. To just take a moment, just between them and Jesus, and write them down on a piece of paper. And then at a time in the service, people would get up out of their seats and they would come over to this cross. And they would begin to pin whatever it was that was making them anxious or angry. Whatever was pushing them to find comfort in an addiction, doubt, despair. There were times when I went over to that cross during the course of a week, and I'd take some of those papers and I would sit down and I would leaf through them. And they spoke about the untimely death of loved ones, about marriages that broke apart, about wayward children, about infidelity, about avarice that was unbridled, and how much they lost. There were many, many of those posters that just wrote on the paper, "Oh God, could you ever forgive me? Could you ever take this away? Can you remove this burden?" See, I ask people to come and pin them to the cross because that cross is an emblem of redemption. That's a cross that demonstrates power. You notice there is no more Jesus on that cross. He has been raised. And in that resurrection, there is a resurrection power for you and for me. So in the light of the resurrection of Jesus, a new day begins to dawn. In Jesus, we find redemption, the forgiveness of sin. We're given a power to face our failings, and we are given a hope that will never disappoint us. So like Peter, the answer is simple. All you have to do is embrace it. By faith, he says, "Come, follow me. Love like Jesus. Learn from Jesus. Lean on Jesus. Build your life on his love because it's a firm foundation. And put your trust in him, and you will not be shaken. In fact, it's time. Rise up. How about that?